Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Well, this week on This Jungian Life, we have a really special treat because we are being joined by Jim Hollis, who is a Jungian analyst who practices in Washington, D.C., and many of you will know Jim for his extensive writings. We have been lucky enough to know Jim as one of our training analysts at the Philadelphia Association of Jungian Analysts. Jim is one of the founding members of PAJA and still teaches for us regularly. And Jim's new book is coming out in June of 2020. It is called Living Between Worlds, Finding Personal Resilience in Changing Times. And we will have a link to that in the show notes. And we're going to just circumambulate that topic amongst ourselves today. And we're really pleased that Jim could join us. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you.
Jim, thinking about the title of your book and the little bit that we've been able to glean through some of the releases leading up to it, it seems like your book is a response to the erosion of external authority, the kind of chaos that's been brewing for a long time, but has come to a real pinnacle recently, and ask the question of where do we look to find a response to what's happening in the world?
Well, this has been a subject of interest to me for a very long time, both as an analyst and also as a student of human history. And the recognition that historically, people's connection to the mysteries, to the living sources that gave them a sense of identity and purpose and belonging and so forth, were communicated to them by way of tribal ritual, mythology, or through sacred institutions. And what we've been seeing over the past few centuries is the progressive erosion of the capacity of those sources to link people to the depths of their encounter with nature, with each other, and with their own souls. This is why Jung said once, rather famously, depth psychology had to be invented at the end of the 19th century, because the burden of meaning had shifted from the tribe to the shoulders of the individual. And so that theme has been of interest to me for so many years. And when I began this book, which was really about 2 years ago, I had no idea that the virus was headed our way like a train on a track. But the issue is perennial for the simple reason that sooner or later, each of us is taken to a place where we're thrown back upon our own resources and where our connections and linkage to the world are imperiled in some way. And right now it's happening on a very large basis. In fact, I would just add a point here. This is the first time since World War II when our entire nation has been gripped in a way where everybody is threatened and everybody is implicated. You could say there are other moments of national experience like 9/11 and so forth, but for so many people, it was way over there. It was out there that it occurred. This is something that has touched every town and every village and every person on the continent, and it brought them a sense of imminent peril of some kind. I'm old enough to remember moments from World War II. And I was acutely aware as a child of the general sense of anxiety that gripped the nation during that time. And while I was safe, I knew the world was not safe. And I knew that my parents were profoundly traumatized by, and their whole psychology was influenced by a combination of the Depression and World War II. Those two events together produced this collective sense of the fact that you could not ultimately trust the institutions of your society to take care of you. You could not ultimately count on the delivery systems that we take for granted. And for so many decades in this country, we have had delivery systems of various kinds, at least for most of our citizens, that we took for granted. And I think now we've seen how sort of imperiled they are and how fragile they are. And I think that's introduced a whole new generation to a kind of collective experience, which each person in his or her fashion has to find their own way.
And that does kind of interrupt our sense of where we find meaning, doesn't it? To feel like we can't trust the institutions that allegedly are there to support us.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, on most mornings, people get up and I'll call it plug in. They plug into their work, to their domestic assignments, to their distractions. And when you can't plug in suddenly, those loose ends are dangling there and produce both anxiety and over time depression. So I think it's been revelatory to see how many people utilize, all of us to some degree, our habituated activities as means of managing our lives, telling us what we're supposed to do on any given day, often giving us a sense of identity and purpose and marching orders, if you will. And you take that away, and a lot of people are having to encounter themselves in a new way, perhaps maybe the first time in their lives.
I'm wondering, though, I think I'm going back to the old Abraham Maslow kind of chart of, when people's needs for money, food, shelter, just basic kind of security is suddenly, kind of yanked out from under them, which is what's happened so suddenly for so many people. I imagine it's pretty hard to go inward and find just in oneself some of those inner resources that I think we're talking about here today.
Well, of course, and it produces a sense of desperation because I was just reading in the paper that they're estimating as many as 40% of restaurants will not reopen. That's a tremendous economic impact, and you think of so many other service industries that are just dying or will never recover or will take years to recover. And so I think this is going to be with us for another 2 to 3 years for sure. And as Bertolt Brecht said once, first comes food and then comes morality. And he certainly is correct there, that we have to see people's basic needs first. And I think our institutions have been rather slow to respond to that.
So, Jim, I'd like to circle back to something that you had mentioned a short bit ago. You'd brought up the reality that something happens when our habits are suspended, whether that's from an external or an internal disruption, that it creates a space. But it also strikes me that the space could be filled with a lot of different things. Individuals can respond to that spaciousness in positive or negative ways. So how can we evoke something that's better into that space, something that's more useful?
Well, first of all, this is not a new phenomenon. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, famous mathematician, inventor, and mystic, said, all of our troubles stem from one source, the inability to be with ourselves in our private rooms. And he said that even the court had to invent the jester, because he said even the king, with all of his privileges, will grow miserable indeed if he confronts himself. Hence we have the jester whose purpose is to distract the king. So when you stop and think about that, you realize, all right, we have a culture whose chief service to us is essentially distraction. I'm talking about popular culture, distraction 24/7, and the ability to sort of be taken away from yourself. And what's happening now is a lot of people are being obliged to have a relationship with themselves, and they're not enjoying the company. That's the problem. Who is this stranger? And one's elemental needs of reassurance, connectivity, a sense of linkage. Those things are significantly disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's producing an enormous amount of pathology. And by pathology, I mean that I'm using it in a non-pathologizing sense of terms. It's a form of suffering because our usual connections are by and large missing, or a lot of them are, including family relationships and so forth. So I think the question then is, what does rush in to fill that space? Monsters can rush in there, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once being in a conversation with a group of analysts, in some city, I think maybe it was Minneapolis, and someone had been waxing eloquently about the redemptive and healing powers of the psyche. And Pat Barry said, you also have to remember there are elements in there that want to destroy you.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a sober reminder and a very useful reminder, and changed the tenor of our conversation. So
yeah,
all that we fear is found within ourselves. And when people don't have those distractions, there's a wonderful poem by Fleur Adcock where she talks about it's being 4 a.m. and all the worst things you could imagine are at the foot of your bed, and they're getting worse and worse and worse. Somehow you wind up laughing at the way she's expressed it, and yet it's that meeting with one's own soul that is so profoundly intimidating.
Right. I'm thinking of Jung's quote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls.
Absolutely. Well, we all have. And the soul has a way of catching up with us, as we know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Talking about the idea of something rushing in, I've become really concerned for several of my own clients who seem to be becoming agoraphobic.
Mm-hmm.
When you had mentioned earlier that everyone is implicated in terms of the current pandemic, and there's a feeling that if you were to leave your apartment, everyone has become a loaded COVID gun that's pointed at you. I'm still waiting to see how that's going to be resolved. People are really frightened to even experiment with returning to some sense of normalcy.
Well, I think that's true, but the other side is also true, and probably even more dangerous, and that's the number of people who are indulging in a kind of magical thinking that we can just will this away. I mean, people's current desire to sort of restore the normal world when things are not normal is very frightening, because the numbers keep going up in those places, as we all know. So it's as if the virus pays attention to our mood. It's as if statistics don't matter. That's the other side of this, is a form of denial is what it amounts to, and a desire to resume the way things were. And I think the culture is going to be permanently changed in some significant ways.
So this is really calling us to a major collective and individual sort of reevaluation. And I'm interested in that interplay between how it affects us at the micro or individual level and how it affects us at the macro or collective level, and what those processes are like, both the denial and the ability, because we're forced into it, to go inward.
Well, I think it's fair to say, and this is no surprise in our world, that whenever there's a trigger, some complex of one kind or another is going to be activated. And so this activates people's complexes. And when you stop and reflect for a moment that our complexes, generally speaking, are generated in our formative history, when a complex is activated and takes over our ego, if only for a short while, it tends to pull us out of this moment and out of our present resources back into an earlier state, which is why there's a lot of regressive behavior, and why, in a certain way, one feels infantilized by this experience. And at the same time, it's sort of like, how do you deal with something that's invisible? If you could make it visible, you could sort of address it or attack it or do something or avoid it. But this is invisible. And I think the irony there is that activates even more possibility for psychological constellation.
Well, because then we can just project on it.
We project on it enormously, absolutely.
Yeah.
And agoraphobia, I mean, there's a difference between prudent distancing when we leave to go grocery shopping, that's one thing. Agoraphobia is a generalized fear of the world out there. And that's when you've moved over into a whole different ballgame, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the difference. I think that all of the risks of being in the world require prudence and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And often I think if we have access to wisdom, we don't have to descend into terrible, catastrophic fears,
Mm-hmm.
because we can formulate a correct response. But this fear that the world as a whole has become lethal to
Mm-hmm.
us, and that the only solution is to get locked into the house month after month after month.
Certainly. And let me just add there, that's a great word, because these complexes I was just referencing tend to catastrophize.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we go to the worst place. And that's the irony. Underneath all of that is, on the other hand, the capacity of the individual to find personal resources that carry us through. I mean, human beings have been imperiled throughout our origin on this planet. And how have we survived? I've been noting how many references there are to taking care of people, which I fully endorse. And at the same time, it's like, yeah, but where is courage? Where is resourcefulness? Where is resilience? Where is discipline? Where is sticking something out? Where is hanging on? That's what gets humanity through these difficult times.
Right. I mean, Jim, you brought up, I think, this really important word a little while ago about infantilizing. And there is something infantilizing about sort of being told to stay in your house all of the time. I think it does put us in that kind of regressive mindset. But courage is required, and a sense of forward thinking and knowing that we can, a belief in our ability to manage, a belief in our ability to win through with some prudence and some courage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also thinking that maybe what we're being called to do through all these things that we've just been talking about is to be able to look at our situation both objectively as well as subjectively, to not get caught up by the complex or caught up in the complex, but somehow be able to also say, now, wait a minute, is like the view from the skybox onto a football field of, wait a minute, yes, this has been difficult and 100 other things, and the world has not suddenly become a disastrously dangerous place, and indeed I can go to the grocery store. That interplay between rising above it and being caught up in it.
Well, I think it might be useful to remind our listeners, too, that when we talk about a complex, we're not making a judgment. We're really talking about charged clusters of our history. We have complexes because we have history. And so it's inevitable that our history is always being evoked, sometimes in a productive way that helps us cope with new situations based on past experience. But it also has the power to take us back to a kind of less empowered time and place in our formation. And that's where the infantilization occurs.
And of course, that's occurring also in relationship to the institutions that we're in relationship with. And there is this way that we can kind of cede our individuality and our individual responsibility to mass organizations. And that puts us in a very childlike place.
Absolutely. Well, and there's a place for institutions. I mean, if ever we've seen it, it's interesting how when we look at the magnitude of the problems facing us, whether they're health issues or economic issues, only large institutions have the power to deal with that. And yet,
absolutely,
institutions have been enervated, and sometimes deliberately so, that makes us even more, in jeopardy.
Yes.
Talking about the current context for a moment, one of the things that I'm really curious about is the way we have outsourced the feeling of risk, that while a large percentage of the population might feel comforted, if not infantilized, staying inside of their apartments or their homes, there still is a feeling that we should be able to call up the grocery store or Amazon and have service people deliver our things. They're out there at the front lines. Nurses are, CNAs are out there, and we are outsourcing the risk to other people. And I'm wondering how that is sitting in the psyche, or how you perceive that.
Well, I think I'm saying what a lot of people have recognized, how we are literally counting on other people to risk their lives to show up at our front door with a package, or in the grocery store stocking the goods. And we, make our lightning entries and get out as soon as possible. And they're there day in and day out. And we all know this burden has fallen disproportionately upon minorities in our country. And that's where the danger is highest. The same is true when you have a kind of national defense system as we have too, which is really based on, elite soldiers and so forth, but not necessarily a burden shared by everybody. I've always thought if politicians had to send their own children into war, we would have far fewer wars for sure. So there are many occasions where, it is the disadvantaged or the minority who are carrying the burden for the majority. And I do think that more people have expressed or maybe recognized exactly what you're talking about here, the gratitude that we all have for this. Because I think it's fair to say that the people who are keeping the system running are, in a sense, literally first responders. Mm-hmm. They're like the people in the hospital or the ambulances and so forth, and they're entitled to combat pay, to hazardous duty, and they're dying in a larger proportion than any of us. So that's a fact, and again, it points to the inequities of our culture. But I would hope there'd be a greater sensitivity to that too.
I'm also wondering if it is in some ways facilitating this catastrophic fear in as much as it's encouraging people to split off their own courage and resilience to project it onto these first responders and or service people, so that then they are relieved from having to find that in themselves.
That's true. No, I think that's absolutely the case. And for many people, their life is uninterrupted. I'm always mindful of Jung's very peculiar sort of description of God as that which flings itself violently across our paths and alters our conscious intentions for good or for ill. It's a very peculiar but very challenging definition, because you could certainly say the pandemic is therefore, metaphorically, a divine act. Because it has altered all of our intentions and all of our systems and all of our personal plans in ways which when it was wholly unexpected, and again throws people back on their own personal resources if they have them.
That's the part that I'm especially interested in, whether it has to do with our current COVID situation or simply any kind of life process, is how to bring ourselves back to ourselves instead of getting caught up in a complex or projecting things onto external authorities of, what might a sort of to-do list developing resilience.
Well, what I'm about to say is so obvious that I hesitate to say it, but it's obvious because it's fundamental. We're born with those innate resources, and it's called instinct. But because we're tiny, fragile, and dependent in a contingent world, we have to repeatedly compromise it and make deals with the world. And so people tend to lose their linkage to those resources. So just to give some examples, when what we're doing is right for us, we are flushed with energy. There's something in the psyche that responds when it's right for us. We can mobilize energy to do the things that have to be done, unfortunately, to serve the tasks of civilization. But over time, if we keep pushing against the current, it leads to burnout and exhaustion and depression and substance abuse and so forth. But if we're doing what's right for us, the energy is there, it's available, something carries us. And you can see how people who are in the proper relationship to their own souls are in a sense carried by that energy. Secondly, we all have feeling functions. We don't choose feelings. There are autonomous qualitative analyses by the psyche. Feeling is being formed independent of what the ego is thinking at any given moment. And so to stop and pay attention to what one is really feeling about something, as opposed to whatever one's instructions may be that override those feelings, is also revelatory. Thirdly, we have compensatory dreams, as we all know. Our dreams are constantly critiquing our conscious life and our experience of this world. And if we stop and pay attention to that, there's a kind of shift of gravity from the external world to the internal world, where I began to realize if I need to know what is right for me, I need to pay attention to some other kind of intelligence that's operative within me. I know you all know that because that's partly what Jung was basing his whole psychology upon, was engaging a dialogue with the wisdom of one's own psyche. And then fourthly is a question of meaning. I think this is a kind of experience that's going to cause some people to truly examine their lives in a very healthy way and say, is the way I'm spending my life really making sense for me? Apart from economic concerns and social values, is this how I want to spend my life? Am I living my journey? And if I am, all right, what's the price? What do I have to do to show up and deal with it? And if I'm not, when am I going to? And that's why I've said on many occasions that the single biggest project of the second half of life is the recovery of personal authority, because our psyches are like air traffic control at O'Hare Airport at rush hour. It's very dense in there. But sort through there and find the voices that, so to speak, come from one's own soul is critical to leading a kind of thoughtful life and leading a self-directive life. And I'm sure out of this experience, there are some, maybe many, who are being obliged or have the opportunity now to go through that kind of sorting and sifting that might not otherwise have happened.
That's really just so thorough and cogent and just beautifully put. So for us to listen to and reconnect with our instincts, pay attention to our feelings and note our dreams, and also orient toward personal meaning, that this is the way through really any crisis, whether it's personal or a global pandemic.
Certainly. I mean, there was a terrible sentence in Viktor Frankl's book from Man's Search for Meaning, where he said, as horrible as Auschwitz was, it was a metaphor for daily life in which people had to make life and death choices, and their values were always up for grabs. So I think by analogy, we could say as terrible as this pandemic is, it's a kind of hyperbolic encounter with the fact that every day we make choices. And from what region of our own psyches are we making those choices? Where are the choices coming from? How many of them are on automatic pilot? How many of them are reflexive? And how many of them I really wish to live and die for? Those are the kinds of questions that sound so obvious once they're spoken. But because of the hurly-burly of daily life and the habituated world that we all have lived, they often get pushed to the roadside.
Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
Jim, I know in your book you're going to be helping people understand the tools that depth psychology can provide. Because of your background in classical literature, you have such a wealth of amplifications there, philosophy and dream work, but also mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, as you've been surveying the world as it is today, we're asking this question of resilience. Is there a myth or a few myths that come to mind that might evoke the field of resilience?
Well, it's a very good question. I think we also need to just briefly define myth here. By myth, we're talking about the nature of the charged images that have the power to move us, to maybe dictate our behaviors and our choices. We're always serving some mythic material, whether we're aware of it or not. And the question is it in some way consistent with the well-being of our souls, or is it a received experience, or is it simply something that we were conditioned into? So I think the basic myth of our time is that each person at some level has to find an individual myth. That is to say, I think we all know as analysts, we can't fix people. We can't save this world. We can't make people better. But we know if we attend a certain process with a certain fidelity and discipline, that something happens, something evolves over time, because we've all experienced it, both in our own analysis years ago and in the contemporary world. So again, I cite that as but one example of a way in which each person in some way has to find, all right, what are the values and issues and behaviors that I find that in some way deepen my journey, provide me with a sense of purposefulness, and which are the ones that distract me and take me away from that. I think there's no single myth that speaks to all of us at this point, other than the experience of the collective experience to which we were referencing before of an invisible but imminent peril. And humankind's been there before, throughout history. And when you're facing that, you're really facing the utter mystery. Because again, mystery and myth come from the same root, and it's the utter mystery of this journey. And we're not in charge. And nature in the end prevails. And I saw a political cartoon a few weeks ago that said, gee, I wish this virus would go away so I could get back to being terrified about global warming. Right. And there's truth to it, because that's an even bigger risk than and we've seen that institutions, governments can be mobilized in large ways and effective ways potentially with a virus, and we're going to have to address that on the field of global warming, because again, in the end, nature rules, we don't, and this is a profound reminder of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking of your point that humanity has been here before, and I think it's possible that humanity has lived in this place of imminent peril for most of our history. We're so used to being relatively safe in our current lives, but 200, 300 years ago and more, the risk of disease was ever present, and it killed many of us, and we didn't understand it. I'm thinking about how in the earlier epochs, Jim, and you've referenced this, we had religions that at least connected us with some larger way to make meaning of the peril, and also reminded us where we were in the scheme of things, that we weren't in charge. I mean, we knew that, but there it was very clearly spelled out for us. But we have forgotten that in a way. And there's some hubris in our modern attitude. And there is a sense, I mean, you referenced the virus, sort of being God-like, being a divine experience. And I think it is in that it puts us back in right relationship in this hierarchy with who really is in charge here. This is a potent reminder.
Well, I've often said that the last time the Western world made sense on a collective level was around 1320. And I say that because with that, the publication of Dante's Commedia, the comedy, because it had a happy ending, namely salvation, there was a portrait of the moral structure of the universe. Now, the average length of life in Dante's time would have been in the early 20s. So as Hume said, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And, but people had, collectively speaking, not every individual, collectively speaking, a world picture and a promise for many of an afterlife, which was the real life. This life as we know it is one that's merely the antechamber to the real life. It's a story. The degree to which it's accepted and believed offers a person a sense of location in the cosmos. But from 1320, that kind of consensus has been eroding. And, and interestingly enough, one of the factors that eroded the institutions of both church and state was, 2 decades later, the Black Death that destroyed 40% of all of Europe and many portions of Asia. So again, the power of institutions to address the autonomy of nature has always been limited. And when that happens, it's a resizing of the ego. You're absolutely right. We live in a time for heroic measures in medicine and space probes and so forth. And there's an enormous inflation. And at least in most sectors of the Western world, the privileged life has been one where food's readily available, medical care is readily available. People are now living into their 80s and 90s. All things considered, it's a life our ancestors would never have imagined. In 1900, the average length of life in North America, US and Canada, was 47. Now it's almost double. And that's an extraordinary statement about the powers of our sciences, which we all respect. And at the same time, along with that can come, as you just suggested, a kind of inflation that says, we're really getting on top of this, aren't we? From time to time, sort of the gods hear that and sit back and say, well, we're going to fix them,
Yeah.
The old story, I think it was Nietzsche who said, that the gods died laughing when Yahweh said he was God, the point being that, wherever there's inflation, there's a counterforce, as we know, that's going to bring about the leveling.
In a way, it sort of takes us right back to where we began in life, of being small and powerless.
Mm-hmm.
But what do we do with it individually and as a collective when we're confronted with it in the force of nature, like this pandemic is forcing us to face?
Well, and that was the essence, really, what historically was called the tragic vision, which is another one of those words that's been sort of misconstrued. Tragic didn't mean something bad happening. Their word for that was catastrophe, right? Or a bad day at work, Because the tragic vision was the hubris that is evoked by the person's fantasy. I know who I am. I'm in charge. I'm making proper choices. I'm free of consequences. I know enough to manage all of this. And the humbling experience meant that the person at the end was in a better state than at the beginning, because he or she then was returned to right relationship to the gods. And so we could say here that part of what this is doing is returning the inflated ego to right relationship to its own position among the various constellations that swirl within our individual psyches. The human ego is but one cluster of energy of many that are there. It's an important cluster because it has to interface with the external world. It's frequently being humbled by its fears, its projections, its collapsed expectations, and so on.
Jim, what do we have access to when we are in right relationship, when we abandon the idea that we are in charge of everything?
Then the question is, what does my soul ask of me? See, that's a different question. Mm-hmm. Because in the first half of life, we all have to develop an ego function to, deal with our parents, deal with playmates, deal with teachers, increasing circles of accountability to move into the external world, to form relationship, find career, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about building the ego in order to be in the world in a productive way. And that's essential. But you see, that's only part of the story. It also can lead to a kind of inflation or over-identification with those roles. I am what I do, or I am my relationships, or I am these marching orders that I have every single day. And that's why we typically see some kind of insurgency from that person's psyche somewhere along the line that reaches up and grabs hold of them. Because the question of the second half of life is, what is the soul asking of me? And I'm using the word soul here as the literal translation of the Greek word psyche. It's that which represents the essence of the person. And it's clear that it's an organ of meaning. It seeks meaning. It suffers the disconnect from meaning. And the psyche is always speaking to us, as you all know. I mean, it speaks through our symptoms, through our mood states, through our elation, through our body, through our feeling function, through our dreams, and so forth. And so part of what then is required is for the ego then to pay more attention to what is the psyche saying to me about how it's viewing this journey. Now, that's a kind of dethronement of the ego's fantasy of sovereignty, autonomy, and clarity of purpose.
Oh, gosh, I love that definition of soul. That is just beautiful. I want to just circle back and pick up on something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Jim. You were talking about how, in 1320, the real life was the afterlife and this life was the antechamber. And I wonder, does depth psychology teach us that the real life, so to speak, is the inner life?
Well, yes, but this real life always takes place in real context too. So the real life occurs in our relationships, in our work, in our callings. I mean, it's not either or, it's both and. The question then is, if I don't have a relationship to my inner life, well, how functional, how productive am I going to be really in the outer life? I might be meeting external standards of production, but driving a wedge further and further within my own soul, which often happens. Because underneath all of that, then the question is, again, the autonomy of the psyche. What is it saying? And if I've lost contact with that, as popular culture, in fact, enables us to do, then I'm simply reporting to the outer world. And I lose connection with my own journey. Because in the end, if you could just imagine, if I'm conscious in my final moments and I look back on my life, will it be possible to say I lived with all mistakes that come and stupid, decisions? I lived my journey as best I could. That's the question.
Yeah.
And something inside of us knows the answer to that. Like when Sartre talked about living in mauvaise foi or bonne foi, good faith or bad faith.
I'm thinking about something somewhere that Jung said that I read about make your experiment with your life.
Yes.
And it's building on what you've said about make your mistakes, but make your experiment. A quality of engagement with authenticity and integrity, an invitation to depth in its sort of positive and, perhaps other kinds of consequences, but be in it.
That takes us back to what we were talking about earlier, because to do that requires a modicum of courage.
Yes, exactly.
You can't do that staying safe in your house.
No, that's true. Just to add another piece to that, if I stop and ask myself, why am I here? I mean, in the large sense of that question, surely it's something more than being a socioeconomic animal that produces something or merely reproducing the species. Why am I here? What am I meant to embody? And I think a question that seldom occurs to us, particularly in the second half of life, is what wants to enter the world through me? See, that's a different question rather than what does the ego want or what does the world want and how do I meet those expectations? But what wants to enter the world through me? And that's where each person in some way has a contribution of their own personhood to bring into this world. And it's in the field of our relationships. It's in the field of our private moments. It's in the field of our engagement in our social structure. So no thing I do in the world out there can be any better than a relationship to my own soul. When you look at it in the field of intimate relationship, you'd have to say, my relationship with another person can't be any more evolved than my relationship to myself. Because wherever I'm stuck or wherever I'm caught in archaic agendas, that's going to be dumped onto this relationship. Maybe it will be dumped onto the other person to carry. Who knows?
I'm sitting in this marvelous question of what wants to enter the world through me. And that's a life meditation, undoubtedly. I'm wondering, Jim, if I may ask, were there seminal moments in your own life where you asked that question and something happened that made the next step particularly clear for you?
Well, yes, I think several occasions. Certainly, I mean, it's hard to even know which ones to reference. It happens almost on a daily basis at some level. I remember once in Zurich, it was the fourth year of my 6 years there, and it had been a particularly dreary Zurich winter, and I came out of analysis having had one more dream, like the proverbial feather on the scales, and it tilted something inside of me. And as I stepped out of there and I saw a glimpse of sun, and I thought there could be an actual spring coming, it was almost like a movie. There was something inside that said, holy cow, or words to that effect. There is a psyche, and it's been speaking all along. In other words, it was telling me what I already knew.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I had to have something sort of drum on the door enough to realize the importance of the changes in the outer world that needed to be made. And even today, when I stop and think about, my own personal life, I was 80 last week. And, when I was young, 80, 60 was old, 65 was dead. So I'm just astonished to be here. And, I've had some health issues. And yet I'm finding myself very much energized by the work that we all do together. There's nothing, there's no greater privilege than to be invited to share someone's life journey with them. And there's no greater privilege than to sort of say, of this vast amount of material and insight in Jung, which I think keeps revealing itself more and more relevant as the years go by, to be a teacher of that material. If I think it's good for me, why would I not want to share it with someone else, you see?
Yeah.
So there's nothing messianic about that. It's not about ego inflation. It's actually surface. This is what the world wants of me. I mean, this is what the psyche wants of me. And yes. I know it because it feels inherently valuable. It feels inherently purposeful. And the day it doesn't, I'll do something else.
So another way of asking that question of what wants to enter the world through me is, what am I in service to?
Mm-hmm.
What God am I serving? I might be, serving the God of more money or any one of a number of things. But to have work that is meaningful and to be able to share it and be in service to something outside ourselves, I think is inherently important.
Well, Jung pointed out, he said, people's religion is not necessarily what they profess as a system of beliefs or practices. He said it's found where they really invest their energy. And in truth, more of our energy goes in on a daily basis to the maintenance of our anxiety management systems, because life is lethal, and some part of us is fully aware of that. And I just think the magnitude of energy spent there. Now that's important, it's necessary, and at the same time, that can also take us away from calling. Because again, calling is vocation, vocatus, vocal, to be called, is about who are you as a person. You're called to live that, embody that, be that, not in an inflated way. It's a humbling thing, quite the contrary. But when you do, that's your gift to other people. Jung spoke so eloquently about this when he said, when you leave the collective instructions, he said, you often incur a debt, a kind of ransom even, and you repay the ransom by returning to the collective as a more evolved person, because that's how the collective is renewed and is increased in some way by bringing a new value to it, a new personhood. And that's what our duty is as people. And that's not about ego inflation. It's a summons to service, because most of the people we would admire in history had very difficult lives. But the people we admire are people who somehow embodied what was meant to be lived through them, and often at grave cost to them. And yet, with a sense of fidelity and courage and persistence, they embodied something that served others. And that's why we value them.
I'm just really chewing on part of what you just said. You started off saying that, Jung said that people's religions are not what they profess, but where they put their energy. And then you mentioned anxiety management systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly right. When I think about the amount of time that many of us, myself included, quite honestly, spend scrolling through social media, for example. And to think about that as an anxiety management system that we sort of need to have in place to just kind of get through the day and shut out the fact that life is lethal. Because if we really took that in, it would be hard to get out of bed in the morning. And how that displaces, a connection with meaning, so kind of a religion that's truly religious, that connects us with something.
Well, to restore the concept of religion, I think, to its original sense, is where you connect with that mystery, or where you stand before that mystery rather than where you evade it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, our biggest anxiety management system, which we all have, frankly, is habit. And one of the things we touched on earlier, the current pandemic has broken the habits of so many people. And with that, anxiety often floods in. And, Jung pointed out in 1912 in his book, Symbols of Transformation, he said, every morning we awaken desiring to drown in our own source, to fall back into the sleep of childhood. That's within us. And the way I put it once years ago in the middle passage, it's like every morning there are two gremlins at the foot of the bed. One is fear and one is lethargy. Fear says it's too much for you. You can't handle it. Life's just huge and you're small. And lethargy says, chill out. Turn on the telly, have some chocolate. Tomorrow's another day. And they're the enemies of life. The enemies of life are intrapsychic, essentially. Those are where the big battles are. As he also said in the same book, a few paragraphs earlier, he said, spirit of evil, strong language, spirit of evil is negation of life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear. And if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. That's pretty clear.
Yeah, it is. And very relevant, I think, to where we find ourselves now.
And this is, I am finding this conversation really so heartening, that we can and are called, and we are called to something greater. And that this is life, and many have been here before us. We're not so different. We're not so special. And we can do this thing called living.
Well, we're all members of the great democracy called mortality. Mm-hmm. And this is a reminder of that.
So, Jim, your book is going to be out next month, mm-hmm. I gather. And it's available for pre-order now. Mm-hmm. So we will make sure that we include links. It looks just fabulous, and I can't wait to read it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And once again, we really appreciate your taking the time to join us this morning on This Jungian Life.
Well, you're welcome. And let me thank you for being part of the dissemination process, because this is exactly what I try to do with my life, and I'm glad you're doing it too. So pleased to be associated with you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
And anytime you want to use my technical expertise, call me again. Right?
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.